Donald Trump's presidency marked a significant departure from traditional American foreign policy. His tenure was characterized by a series of bold and often controversial moves that redefined the way the United States interacted with the rest of the world. These moves were not just political maneuvers, but also a reflection of his unique worldview and business-oriented mindset. His approach, often described as America First, prioritized American interests above all else. This philosophy was not just a slogan, but a guiding principle that influenced every aspect of his foreign policy decisions. It was a call to reassert American sovereignty and to ensure that the US was no longer, in his view, being taken advantage of by other nations. This approach challenged long-standing alliances and norms, creating ripples across the global stage. Traditional allies found themselves questioning the reliability of the United States as a partner, while adversaries were often left guessing about America's next move. This unpredictability was both a strategic tool and a source of global tension. Trump's unconventional style, characterized by directness and a disdain for diplomatic protocol, often surprised and unsettled world leaders. His preference for blunt communication over the usual diplomatic niceties was a stark contrast to the more measured tones of his predecessors. This direct approach was intended to cut through what he saw as unnecessary bureaucracy and get straight to the point. He questioned the value of multilateral agreements and institutions, favoring bilateral deals that he believed would yield more favorable outcomes for the United States. This was evident in his approach to trade agreements, where he sought to renegotiate terms that he felt were unfair to American workers and businesses. His administration's renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA is a prime example of this strategy in action. Trump's foreign policy was driven by a deep skepticism of globalism and a belief that other countries were taking advantage of American generosity. He often spoke about the need for the United States to stop being the world's policeman and to focus more on its own national interests. This inward focus was a significant shift from the more globalist policies of previous administrations. He argued that the United States had been too willing to shoulder the burdens of global leadership, both financially and militarily. This perspective led to calls for increased defense spending by NATO allies and a re-evaluation of America's role in international conflicts. He believed that allies should contribute more to their own defense, reducing the financial strain on the US. His goal was to rebalance these relationships, ensuring that America's interests were always paramount. This often meant taking a hard line in negotiations and being willing to walk away from deals that did not meet his standards. This hard-nosed negotiating style was a hallmark of his business career, and he brought it into the political arena. This approach, while appealing to some who felt that the US had become overextended, also generated anxiety among allies accustomed to American leadership and predictability. The uncertainty surrounding US commitments led to a sense of instability in international relations. Allies were often left in a state of flux, unsure of the U.S. next move. Trump's focus on transactional diplomacy, prioritizing immediate gains over long-term strategic considerations, also drew criticism. Many experts argued that this short-term focus could undermine America's strategic interests in the long run. They warned that such an approach might sacrifice long-term stability for short-term victories. Critics argued that this approach undermined America's credibility and eroded trust in its commitments. They pointed to the withdrawal from international agreements and abrupt policy shifts as evidence of a lack of consistency and reliability. This inconsistency was seen as damaging to the U.S. reputation as a stable and dependable global leader. They pointed to instances where Trump's abrupt policy shifts and unpredictable behavior created confusion and instability on the world stage. This unpredictability was seen in various areas, from trade wars to sudden changes in military strategy. Such actions often left both allies and adversaries scrambling to adjust to the new reality. Nevertheless, Trump remained steadfast in his belief that his approach was necessary to restore America's standing in the world and advance its interests. He argued that a strong, assertive America was better positioned to negotiate from a place of strength and secure better deals for its citizens. His supporters believed that this assertiveness was long overdue and necessary for the US to reclaim its position on the global stage. One of the most significant areas where Trump's foreign policy approach manifested was in his dealings with NATO. His interactions with the alliance were marked by a distinct shift from previous administrations, emphasizing a more transactional approach to international relations. This approach was characterized by a focus on immediate benefits and costs, rather than long-term strategic interests. A cornerstone of American foreign policy since its inception, NATO represents a military alliance of North American and European countries committed to collective defense. This alliance has been pivotal in maintaining peace and stability in the region, especially during the Cold War era. Over the decades, NATO has evolved to address new security challenges, adapting its strategies and expanding its membership. Trump, however, repeatedly questioned the relevance of NATO in the 21st century, particularly its financial burden-sharing arrangements. He often highlighted the disparity in contributions, suggesting that the current model was outdated and unfair to American taxpayers. His administration argued that the financial commitments of NATO members needed to reflect the contemporary security environment. He argued that European members were not contributing their fair share to the alliance's costs, relying too heavily on American military might. This, he claimed, placed an undue burden on the United States, which was already stretched thin with its global military commitments. The American military presence in Europe, while crucial, was seen as disproportionately funded by the US. Trump's criticisms of NATO's funding structure were not entirely unfounded. The alliance's budget has long been a point of contention, with the United States consistently shouldering a significant portion of the financial load. This has led to ongoing discussions about how to create a more equitable distribution of financial responsibilities among member states. While the United States has consistently been the largest contributor to the alliance's budget, many European members have fallen short of their defense spending commitments. This discrepancy has led to ongoing debates about the fairness and sustainability of the current funding model. The 2% GDP target for defense spending, agreed upon by NATO members, has often been missed by several countries. Trump's repeated calls for increased defense spending from NATO allies, however, were often delivered in a confrontational manner, straining relations within the alliance. His blunt approach and public criticisms were seen by many as undermining the spirit of cooperation that NATO was built upon. This approach created tensions and sometimes overshadowed the underlying message of shared responsibility. He accused some members of being delinquent in their payments and threatened to withdraw the United States from the alliance if they did not meet their obligations. This threat, while alarming to many, was intended to push NATO members towards greater financial responsibility. The potential withdrawal of the US from NATO would have significant implications for global security dynamics. While Trump's tactics ruffled feathers, his pressure campaign did have some impact. The heightened scrutiny and demands for increased spending led to a renewed focus on defense budgets among NATO members. This renewed focus was seen as a necessary step to ensure the alliance's readiness and capability to respond to modern threats. Several NATO members, including Germany and France, increased their defense spending in response to his demands. These increases were seen as a positive step towards a more balanced sharing of the financial burden within the alliance. The commitment to higher defense budgets was a sign of solidarity and recognition of the need for a robust collective defense. However, it remains to be seen whether these increases will be sustained in the long term. The political and economic landscapes in Europe are constantly evolving, and future administrations may have different priorities. The challenge will be to maintain these commitments amidst changing domestic and international pressures. Moreover, Trump's rhetoric about NATO's obsolescence raised concerns about the future of the alliance and America's commitment to European security. His questioning of NATO's relevance prompted a broader debate about the role of such alliances in a rapidly changing world. This debate is crucial as it addresses the evolving nature of threats and the need for adaptive strategies. As the world faces new and emerging threats, the need for strong alliances and collective defense mechanisms remains crucial. The discussions initiated by Trump have sparked a necessary conversation about how NATO can adapt and remain effective in the years to come. This conversation includes considerations of cyber threats, terrorism, and other non-traditional security challenges. Ultimately, the call for financial burden sharing within NATO is a reflection of broader questions about international cooperation and shared responsibilities. As NATO moves forward, it will need to balance these demands with the need to maintain unity and collective security. The future of NATO will depend on its ability to evolve and address both traditional and modern security challenges effectively. Trump's approach to Russia was perhaps the most controversial aspect of his foreign policy. His tenure was marked by a series of unprecedented moves and statements that left both allies and adversaries questioning the direction of US foreign policy. The unpredictability of his actions created a sense of unease among traditional US allies, who were accustomed to a more consistent and predictable American stance on global issues. He repeatedly expressed admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin and downplayed Russia's interference in the 2016 US presidential election, despite the findings of American intelligence agencies. This admiration was often showcased in public forums, where Trump would praise Putin's leadership style and express a desire to work closely with him. Such public displays of admiration were unprecedented and raised eyebrows both domestically and internationally. This stance fueled accusations that Trump was too willing to appease Putin and overlook Russia's aggressive actions on the world stage. Critics argued that such a position undermined the United States' standing and emboldened Russia to pursue its geopolitical ambitions without fear of significant repercussions. The perception of a US president being lenient towards a historical adversary was unsettling for many, leading to widespread protests and political cartoons that depicted the controversial relationship. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and continues to support separatists in the eastern part of the country, presented a significant challenge for Trump's administration. The situation in Ukraine was a flashpoint in US-Russia relations, with many viewing it as a test of America's commitment to international law and the sovereignty of nations. The conflict not only strained diplomatic ties but also highlighted the broader struggle for influence in Eastern Europe. While imposing sanctions on Russia for its actions in Ukraine, Trump also sought to improve relations with Moscow, seeing potential for cooperation on issues such as counterterrorism and arms control. This dual approach was seen as an attempt to balance punitive measures with diplomatic engagement, a strategy that had mixed results. The sanctions were intended to signal disapproval, yet the simultaneous outreach to Russia created a complex and often contradictory foreign policy narrative. This dual-track approach, however, drew criticism from those who believed that engaging with Putin would only embolden him. They argued that without a firm stance, Russia would continue its aggressive policies, not just in Ukraine but in other regions as well. The critics feared that a lack of decisive action would send a message of weakness, potentially inviting further provocations from Russia. Trump's efforts to improve relations with Russia were further complicated by allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election. These allegations led to a highly charged political environment, with investigations and media scrutiny dominating much of Trump's presidency. The constant media coverage and political debates over the interference allegations created a backdrop of tension and suspicion. The appointment of a special counsel to investigate these allegations cast a long shadow over Trump's presidency and hampered his ability to engage with Russia without facing accusations of collusion. The investigation, led by Robert Mueller, became a focal point of national and international attention, further straining US-Russia relations. The probe's findings and the subsequent political fallout added layers of complexity to an already fraught relationship. Despite these challenges, Trump continued to pursue a more cooperative relationship with Russia, arguing that it was in America's best interest to find common ground with Moscow on issues of mutual concern. He believed that collaboration on global issues such as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and regional conflicts could yield significant benefits for both nations. However, the legacy of his approach to Russia remains a topic of intense debate, reflecting the complexities and contradictions of his foreign policy. The long-term impact of his strategies on US-Russia relations and global stability continues to be a subject of analysis and discussion among experts and policymakers. In a significant departure from the policies of his predecessors, Trump embarked on a high-stakes diplomatic gamble with North Korea. He engaged in direct talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, culminating in a historic summit in Singapore in 2018. This unprecedented meeting marked the first time a sitting US president had met with a North Korean leader. Trump's willingness to engage with Kim directly, without preconditions, was a significant break from the traditional diplomatic playbook. Trump's approach to North Korea was driven by a belief that previous administrations had failed to make progress on denuclearization through sanctions and isolation. He argued that only through direct engagement with Kim could he hope to persuade him to relinquish his nuclear arsenal. The summits between Trump and Kim generated significant media attention and raised hopes for a breakthrough in the long-stalled negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program. Despite the initial optimism, however, the talks ultimately failed to produce a concrete agreement on denuclearization. North Korea continued to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile programs, while Trump's critics argued that he had legitimized Kim's regime without extracting any meaningful concessions in return. Nevertheless, Trump's diplomatic overture to North Korea represented a significant shift in US policy, the long-term implications of which remain to be seen and understood. In this chapter, we will explore the broader implications of Trump's foreign policy on global trade and alliances. Trump's America First agenda sought to rebalance trade relationships that he argued were unfair to the United States. This approach led to a series of tariffs and trade disputes, most notably with China. The US-China trade war saw both countries imposing tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods, disrupting global supply chains and affecting economies worldwide. Trump's administration also renegotiated key trade agreements, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which was replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. These moves were aimed at securing better terms for American workers and industries, but they also created uncertainty and tension with traditional allies. Moreover, Trump's foreign policy had significant implications for international alliances. His calls for NATO members to increase their defense spending were met with mixed reactions. While some allies agreed to boost their contributions, others were concerned about the potential weakening of the alliance's unity. Trump's approach to foreign policy reflected a shift towards a more transactional and unilateral stance, challenging the multilateral frameworks that had defined US diplomacy for decades. This shift had far-reaching consequences for global trade, economic stability, and the balance of power in international relations. As we reflect on these developments, it is crucial to consider the long-term impacts of Trump's policies on the global stage. Will the changes he initiated lead to a more equitable international system, or will they create new challenges and uncertainties in an interconnected world? Only time will tell.